The air was thick with expectation as the last transports of captured German soldiers made their way across the Atlantic. These men, many of them young, many of them hardened by years of rationed food, scarcity, and the steady grind of war, were prepared for the worst. They imagined bleak barracks behind barbed wire, minimal meals, cold showers, hard labor, the grim monotony of captivity. Yet what awaited them would upend every assumption they carried. From the moment they were processed into the vast system of U.S. prison camps, the contrast between propaganda and reality began to sharpen. The sweeping German narrative had painted America as weak, decadent, economically broken, morally adrift. And here they were, stepping into a country of stout logistic machines, abundant supplies, and surprising hospitality. They didn't immediately realize they were witnessing a quiet kind of victory for Western democratic values, one served up on a tray. Imagine standing in a mess hall as a German soldier in 1944. In Germany, by then, you'd been told to expect hardship and sacrifice. Sugar was rationed, chocolate nearly a memory of childhood, ice cream long gone. Now you're handed a chocolate bar, something you haven't tasted in years or maybe ever. Plus you're told you can buy a bottle of Coke for 5 cents. The shock is physical, the sweet, the cold, the fizz. It pulls you out of the war grit you've grown used to and nudges you into a new kind of awareness. One veteran, later recounting his time at Camp Lewis in Washington State, said his first thought was, "The last ice cream I had been able to buy in Germany was years ago, but Coca-Cola? Never before." He recognized in that moment the profound implication. The enemy that had been told America was collapsing, starving, defeated, was in fact a nation feeding its captives, and feeding them well. But the story isn't simply about food. It's about human psychology, ideology, expectation, and surprise. The logistic machine of the U.S. Army and its civilian supply chain had created an environment of material plenty even in wartime. The German POWs, most of whom expected deprivation, saw trucks, kitchens, supply lines, they saw resources. This broke the narrative that America was failing. Instead, they witnessed proof to the contrary. As one article puts it, German POWs gained an average of 25 pounds during their 3-year stay in the U.S. camps. Let us rewind to the point of capture. Many of these men were part of the Afrika Korps, or engaged in the later European campaigns, surrendering in North Africa or across Europe. They arrived in U.S. hands with the expectation of harsh treatment, a hardened belief established by years of Nazi propaganda. Once aboard transport ships, they found food, space, and a logic of logistics that stunned them. According to one study, they discarded more food each day than the soldiers had eaten daily in the last 2 years. On arrival in the United States, they were processed, housed, paid, modestly, for labor, and given access to canteens where chocolate bars, soft drinks, and cold desserts were available. They saw American civilians and American soldiers eating the same fare. They witnessed blacks and whites working side by side, women in factories, minorities at work, pragmatic equality in action. Against the ideology they'd been fed about racial purity, hierarchical closure, sacrifice for the cause, it created cognitive friction. This wasn't the decadent enemy they had been told they faced. This was something different. Picture a Sunday afternoon in a Midwestern farm town where a POW camp is located. The local farm families invite prisoners to dinner. These men, once enemies, are now being hosted as guests. They walk into homes, see children playing, see refrigerators full of milk which by then was scarce in Germany. See menus that list meat, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, apple pie. They taste ice cream for dessert. They hear laughter, conversation, elements of everyday American life. These experiences were not accidental. They belonged to a system of humane treatment of prisoners, rooted in the conventions of war, but also revealing of deeper strategic insight. That generosity, human dignity, and abundance could change hearts. Back in Germany, meanwhile, the population was starving. Ration cards, black markets, textile and sugar shortages, chocolate impossible to obtain except by the privileged few. German soldiers knew that their wives, children, neighbors were suffering. Then they themselves arrive in U.S. camps and are treated well. And for some, they send back American chocolate bars and packages to their families. The contrast could not have been more stark. What we are witnessing is not only the story of captured soldiers and food supplies. It is a story of how a society's capacity for abundance becomes a weapon, not of destruction but of persuasion. The spoils are not tanks or captured territory, they are changed minds. The enemy sees our mess halls, our supply trucks, our ice cream cones and Coca-Colas, and wonders, did we lose because we lacked ideology, or because we lacked the resources to feed our own men and persuade them by our example? Historians such as Arnold Kramer have noted that many German POWs returned home with a changed view of the United States, sometimes even an admiration, for a system that had fed them well, treated them decently, and then let them go home. This first section sets the stage. War, capture, expectation, shock. The next sections will dive into specific camps, the daily life of these POWs behind the fence, the menus, the social interactions, the ideological ripple effects. They arrived at the camps, many still stunned by the sea voyage and the surrender, still grappling with the gap between their expectations and reality. Imagine this, rail cars clanking into a base camp somewhere in the U.S., perhaps in the Midwest or South, the sound of American accents, the sight of U.S. Army trucks rolling supplies, and soldiers in U.S. uniform treating them not quite as mortal enemies to be broken, but as prisoners to be housed, fed, processed. According to one survey of camps, more than 400,000 primarily German POWs were held in about 500 camps across the U.S. from 1942 to 45. In the men's personal logbooks and later recollections, one of the repeated refrains was a kind of bewildered gratitude. We expected dust and starvation. Instead, we got mattresses, blankets, food we hadn't seen in years. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, for example, one prisoner remarked the conditions, compared to German standards, were like a vacation. This isn't to suggest luxurious resort stays, but the contrast was so vivid that the POWs often compared their captivity more favorably than their previous frontline trenches. Let's zoom in on the canteen. This is the place where the shock waves meet reality. The U.S. Army set up canteens inside many of these camps, allowing POWs to purchase non-rationed items with pay earned from supervised labor. Ice cream, soda pop, including Coca-Cola bottles, chocolate bars, luxuries to these men. One blog summarizes, they were able to buy items from the canteen such as cigarettes, soda, or ice cream. Prisoners were shocked to see many items available for purchase that were unavailable back home because of shortages and rationing. Picture yourself in the line. German uniform, prisoner tag, walking toward a metal shutter that opens to reveal glass soda bottles glowing in a cooler, or ice cream scooped into a cone. One German veteran later recalled that the sugar, the cold treat, the fizz of the soda, it felt like a small act of surrender to the realization that the American logistic base was not weak. It worked. Fed. Supplied. You drank, you ate, you noticed. And the portion sizes turned many heads. In Germany at the time, sugar was carefully rationed, chocolate was rare, ice cream almost an afterthought. The Nazi regime's propaganda had promised ultimate victory and plenty, but the reality by 1944 was scarcity. Contrast that with U.S. supply trains, proper sleeping quarters, and yes, ice cream served aboard ships and in camp messes. One Reddit comment, the German army cooks had a longer training time, I think it was something like 3 times as long, so the food was better there. This is tongue-in-cheek, but it underscores the astonishment. Now, the labor component. Many German POWs were assigned to work detachments, commandos, on farms, in factories, even building camp structures or roads. The U.S. manpower shortage made this practical. The POWs were paid small wages, which they could spend. They got out of their barracks, sometimes into American towns. They saw the interior of America. In many places, local families invited them to Sunday dinners or picnics. The barrier of being enemy thinned when you shared a meal across a table, laughing half-inhibitedly, noticing that the man across from you was once your foe but now simply someone eating mashed potatoes, turkey, ice cream. Think about such a scene. A farm family in Missouri, 1944. German POW at a long wooden table in the yard. The sun low in the sky, plates conspicuous with meat, potatoes, gravy, fresh vegetables. For dessert, ice cream in bowls, scoops melting in the summer warmth, perhaps hot fudge or fruit. Somewhere nearby, a bottle of Coca-Cola sweating in the shade. The POW looks around and realizes, this is America. This is wartime America. And it's doing okay. That realization, slow, creeping, began to challenge the narrative he was fed back home. The ideological aspect of this cannot be overstated. For many German soldiers, propaganda had delivered the message. Germany is strong, pure, destined for victory. The American enemy is decadent, collapsing, weak. But when they landed in the U.S., they were fed from the same mess as U.S. enlisted men, or almost so. One historian notes that the diet of German POWs in the U.S. often matched that of the U.S. troops. At Camp Ruston, for example, prisoners ate the same food as their captors. That is a psychological earthquake. To surrender is one thing. To then be fed as well as or nearly as well as your captors is something else entirely. Here's a key turning point: the care packages. Many German POWs sent American chocolates and other items back to their families. Items the families back home couldn't buy due to rationing and wartime shortages. The gesture was loaded with symbolism. If I'm my father's son and I'm captured by the Americans and I have these things, what does that say about where we stand? The prisoners were not only nourished but given the sense of being part of a system that had resources, logistics, respect. The idea that one might not hate the captor but learn from them, and perhaps even admire them, was radical. You learn something new every day. The Navy built a 300-foot ice cream barge in WWII that made 10 gallons every 7 minutes to boost morale. While that refers to the Navy, the idea of U.S. capacity to produce luxury items even in war underscored what POWs saw. Another layer: the Thanksgiving dinners and special events inside camps. Some camps hosted American-style holiday meals for POWs. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry, pie. These were not part of some propaganda show entirely. They reflected standard U.S. Army practice, partly out of compliance with the Geneva Convention, but also reflecting a culture of supply and morality. The message landed with the POWs: we are enemies, but we are human, and we will extend the norms of decency to you. And decency matters in the minds of soldiers who spent years thinking that surrender meant suffering, not hospitality. Now, imagine ourselves inside the barracks late at night. A POW soldier sits on his bunk, chocolate bar wrapper in hand, listening to distant camp noises, perhaps someone tapping a harmonica, maybe the American camp guard walking by. He thinks, back home, my kid wouldn't have seen this. I wouldn't have had this chocolate. I wouldn't have had this soda. The cognitive dissonance builds. The narrative of superiority he'd absorbed starts to wobble. Slowly but steadily, the camp and its supply chain become a classroom where the lesson is: abundance plus decency equals legitimacy. The regime you fought for promised sacrifice and victory. You surrendered and were fed. The regime you fought against promised weakness and decadence. You were treated well and given luxury. Which side is telling the truth? Let's be clear. This was not a mass conversion of POWs into Democrats or ideologues overnight. Many remained loyal, many hated captivity, many just wanted to go home. But historians note subtle shifts. Some returned to Germany with more favorable impressions of America than they had believed possible. Some wrote home about their captors with words like good or well-treated instead of monstrous. For all the violence of the war, this was an ideological twist. A captive enemy soldier tasting ice cream, sipping a Coke, thinking about his family back home starving. They began to compare systems. And comparison matters. There are additional logistical details worth dwelling on because they deepen our understanding of the phenomenon. The U.S. Army, already mobilized for global war, had enormous supply chain infrastructure. Rails to ports, ships across oceans, tanker trucks, refrigerated cars, mess halls everywhere. That infrastructure spilled over into the POW camps. According to the Fold 3 blog on POW camps, the U.S. adhered to the Geneva Convention, treated POWs with compassion, allowed work, medical care, and had canteens where soda or ice cream could be bought. For a German soldier used to near-constant rationing and increasingly dire supplies, this was jarring. And let's not ignore the social interactions. In many camps, POWs were allowed limited contact with local civilian population under supervision. Farm work, community events, picnics. These encounters humanized the enemy, broke the other image. When you sit beside a Missouri farmer at a picnic table, share lemonade, talk about hometowns through a translator or with common language, the wall between enemy and other human being becomes porous. Some POWs later said that meeting American families, hearing about their kids, seeing houses with more room than their German home had, seeing refrigerators full of milk, these were the cracks in the narrative of American weakness. Here's a microscene. It's dusk. German POWs exit the mess hall carrying trays. They stroll toward the canteen window. A guard smiles at one of them. The POW nods. He orders a Coke for 5 cents, a price that amazed him. The soda cracks open, fizz rising, condensation on the glass. He glances at the American GI across the way, who has a similar soda and is friendly. He sits on a bench in the compound yard and wonders, if we are the victors of destiny, why do we now sit here being fed by these people? The ideological shift is almost unconscious, but it is real. Another critical factor, returning home and the aftereffects. When the war ended, the POWs were gradually repatriated to Germany. Some arrived home to physical devastation, starvation, ruined infrastructure. They had seen in the United States the supply, the comfort, the logistic prowess. That contrast weighed on their memories. Some German families were stunned when their sons, recently POWs, sent back American chocolate bars or recounted stories of meals and sodas. The returning POWs sometimes found it difficult to reconcile their previous patriotism with what they had lived. In many cases, the treatment they had received in U.S. camps was among the better experiences of their wartime lives. We can summarize this section's key turnings: arrival and astonishment, camp life and canteen surprises, social and work interactions with Americans, the psychological chasm created by abundance in the enemy's land, the simmering ideological transformation. The stage is now set for the final phases. The end of captivity, repatriation, long-term ripple effects in Germany and America. They settled into camp routines. Roll call, work detail, meals, quiet hours, letters home. For many of the German prisoners, the rhythm of each day came with surprising novelties. The mess hall, once only a place to endure a loaf of bread and some stew, became a site of revelation. Trays loaded with meat, fresh vegetables, generous dessert portions. The canteen still beckoned. Ice cream cones, soda bottles, chocolate bars. In one interview, Gunter Graw, 18 years old when captured, said, "The last ice cream I had been able to buy in Germany was years ago, but Coca-Cola? Never before." At that moment he realized the magnitude of what he had walked into. The United States could feed its prisoners well, even its enemies. This wasn't merely about treats. It became a mirror, what we are promised versus what we live. In Germany, by 1944, the war machine drained civilian life. Rationing, shortages, constant austerity. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the supply lines hummed, the mess halls ran, the desserts flew. To suddenly find oneself on the other side of the wire, not starving but being fed beyond expectation, produced a disorientation. And disorientation opens the door for doubt. If your propaganda told you the enemy was collapsing, decadent, incapable of sustaining itself, and you see evidence to the contrary, your belief system shakes. Consider camp life beyond the food. The labor assignments put POWs into real American places. Farms in the Midwest, factories in the South, orchards in California. They met local Americans, worked side by side, albeit under supervision. Walked through towns, glimpsed American families, homes, cars, cafes. They heard English, saw children playing in yards, refrigerators buzzing, milk bottles on doorsteps. This was everyday America, normality, not war-torn deprivation. Some local communities invited POWs to church services or picnics. Some American families, whose sons were away at war, treated these prisoners almost as guests. The barrier of enemy other thinned in the face of human interaction. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the war machine's ability to feed both soldiers and prisoners served as proof of logistic dominance. The old adage, "an army marches on its stomach," took on new layers. Here was an army that could feed not just its troops but prisoners and civilians alike. That capability echoed across battlefields of morale, ideology, and global perception. The enemy's surprise was the ally of American soft power. There were critics, of course. Some in the U.S. questioned why enemy soldiers were receiving such luxuries. Others pointed out inequalities. How could German POWs sometimes have better food than disadvantaged U.S. civilians, or than certain segregated communities? These tensions add complexity to the narrative. The story isn't one of pure triumph but of ironic juxtaposition. A democratic society that proclaimed freedom still wrestled with discrimination. A society that could feed its enemies still housed them behind fences. The contrast is stark and instructive. In the months after V-Day, repatriation began. Many German POWs returned to a devastated Germany. Some went back changed. In personal letters and later memoirs, a number admitted that their view of the United States shifted from enemy to curiosity, from enmity to begrudging respect. One memoir cited a former POW stating, "What I learned in America made me question what we had fought for." Others carried home weight gain, new language skills, acquaintances with Americans, and even a belief that the enemy had treated them better than their own ideology had promised. What of the long-term ripple effects? In post-war Germany, the presence of returning POWs who had lived in American camps created networks of personal experience. I was in Missouri Farm X. I worked in Texas. I bought Coke and ice cream. These experiences became part of memory culture, influencing public perception of America amongst veterans, families, and local communities. The story of American abundance made its way into German communities as anecdote, memoir, even folklore. From the U.S. side, this episode contributed to America's global reputation as much more than just a victor by arms. It became an example of how abundance and decency can serve as instruments of influence. The capacity to feed, to host, to treat captured enemies humanely was an ideological statement. If you win by logistics and persuasion, the result may endure longer than bombs. The irony: the heavy war machines were visible. The softer war machines, supply lines, canteens, dessert bars were silent yet powerful. Let's highlight a microscene. A late summer evening in July 1945. The German POW stands outside the mess hall, tray in hand, dessert melting under the sun. He chats quietly with a U.S. Army sergeant, who shares his own worries about the war, his family back home, the possibility of victory. The POW realizes that the man opposite him is also human, also worried, also working the system. The guard smiles, asks if he wants a Coke. The POW says yes. The guard nods. The soda fizzes. The POW tastes it. He thinks, "This is not the enemy I thought. This is a man, with milk delivered to his home, with a roof over his head, not anticipating starvation tomorrow." It's a small moment, yet it is a crack in the ideological wall. Another important dimension: the role of the American Red Cross parcels and the Geneva Convention. While many narratives focus on the dessert and soda, the structural frameworks of humane treatment supported the story. The U.S. Army complied with international obligations, but the scope of supply went beyond minimums. The packet of sugar, the bar of chocolate, the bottle of soda, these were not necessities but symbols. In this sense, the culinary experience becomes a form of ideological nourishment. The enemy soldier is not broken by starvation but engaged by civility. Let's also consider the element of contrast in memory. In Germany, civilians and returning soldiers often remembered hunger, the black market, the missing luxuries. Meanwhile, POWs remembered the ice cream truck in the camp yard, the soda cooler, the enormous American mess hall. When they went home, they sometimes found their towns destroyed, ration cards in effect, bicycles replacing cars, children going without. They carried inside them the memory of what might have been if logistics and peace rather than destruction had held sway. It is this memory which made them quietly question their former allegiance. We must not romanticize this story into a fairy tale of hearts and minds wholly converted. Many things remained brutal, many camps were strict, many prisoners simply wanted to go home. The U.S. Army was still a victor controlling enemies. There were fences, guards, uniforms, limits to movement. The ideological transformation was modest, subtle, and indirect. But the power lies in subtlety. A man who expected dirt and insult instead gets soft ice cream, respect, a soda, and wonders. Maybe we lost not because our idea was bad, but because our system lacked capacity to nourish and persuade. In this section, we've traced the deepening of the shock of abundance, the social and ideological consequences, the return-home tension, and the long ripple of memory. The next section will move toward repatriation, how the former POWs fared after returning to Germany, how American abundance impacted German public opinion and veteran memory, and how this episode fits inside the larger narrative of ideological and logistic warfare in World War II. The trains clattered deeper into the heartland of a country the prisoners barely knew. Outside the barred windows, the landscape unfolded like a film reel flicking from one impossible frame to the next. Endless farms, grain silos rising like metallic castles, rows of stores with bright neon signs advertising goods the men had only dreamed of. Children waved from street corners, not in fear, not in hatred, but curious delight. Some threw baseballs in the streets. Others pedaled bicycles with gleaming chrome. Dogs barked happily, chasing the trains as if escorting honored guests. To the German soldiers, who had spent years steeled against hatred and deprivation, this was bewildering. They had been told America was decadent, collapsing under its own chaos. But there was no collapse out here, only abundance. When the guards allowed them fresh air breaks, the smell alone caused an ache in their stomachs. Warm bread, roasting meat, something sweet and creamy drifting from small-town diners. Ice cream. Many of the prisoners stared at the white, swirling dessert being enjoyed casually by local teenagers. Their minds spun. In Germany, such riches were rationed for children on their birthdays, if that. Here, even stray children licked enormous scoops as if it were a trivial treat. And Coca-Cola. The men's eyes locked onto glass bottles glinting in the hands of farmers and laborers. This mythical drink, rumored to be a creation of capitalist excess, was everywhere. So common that kids half-finished a bottle and tossed it away as casually as someone might drop a stone. What was this place? Later that night, when the prisoners were transferred onto trucks, a few were bold enough to whisper to the guards, "What is that black drink? Does it give energy? Is it medicine?" The guards laughed, tapping their own bottles, the contents fizzing like captured thunder. "Just Coke," one American guard said. "Helps wash down a burger." Burger? The word was new. It sounded like another luxury. They were taken to camps surrounded by wooden fences, not iron cages. The barracks were clean, with beds that didn't sag into the dirt. Blankets smelled of detergent, not mildew. And on their first morning in captivity, they discovered something that nearly brought tears to their eyes. Coffee. Real coffee. Hot. Strong. Endless. One POW named Ernst Richter, who had been captured in Tunisia, lifted the steaming tin cup to his lips. His hands shook. In the desert, he had survived on bitter roasted barley water. This was civilization itself. As he drank, a smiling cook shouted for the next man in line. On the wooden counter, under the steam of scrambled eggs and sausage, sat something else. A vat of creamy white coldness. He tilted his head. Was it lard? Milk? No. The cook scooped a generous mound onto a tray. Ice cream. For breakfast. The prisoners looked at one another, stunned into stillness. In a war that had turned Europe into a furnace, here was a food so luxurious that Americans served it in the morning like it was nothing more special than boiled potatoes. Richter took his first bite. The cold shocked his teeth. Then he tasted it. Sweetness so pure, so indulgent, his throat ached. He would remember that moment for the rest of his life. That day, the men wandered the camp in a haze of disbelief. They searched for signs of cruelty, but found libraries instead. Some barracks had radios blasting swing music, the melodies foreign yet joyful, full of brass and laughter. Workshops allowed carpentry and painting. Sports fields stretched wide under the sun. They were not being punished. They were being hosted. The contrast to Germany was brutal. Back home, Their families scavenged for potato peels while cities burned. Bread lines stretched for blocks. He who was strong stole from the weak. Children grew thin, too weak to play. People dreamed of sausages that had long ago disappeared from butchers' windows. Yet here, the enemy was feeding their prisoners steak and ice cream. To many, the most shocking reality of all was this: America wasn't starving because of the war. America wasn't starving at all. Days turned into weeks. The guards were not saints, but they were astonishingly normal. Young men who taught the prisoners how to toss a baseball or how to pronounce cheeseburger correctly. They wore uniforms, yes, but they laughed often. Some joked about the weather, about their sweethearts back home, about how hot dogs were not actually made of dogs. The POWs chuckled nervously, trying to understand a humor so casual it barely seemed like military behavior. One German prisoner, Corporal Lucas Hartmann, approached a sergeant after dinner. "Excuse me," he asked, stumbling over the English words he was still learning. "Why do you give us all this?" He gestured to the dining hall, where prisoners scraped up the last remnants of mashed potatoes, gravy clinging to their spoons like a secret. The sergeant shrugged. "Army says to. Geneva rules. Plus, it's just the American way, pal. The American way." The phrase echoed like a sermon. At night, the men gathered around their bunks to talk in hushed voices. They questioned everything they had been taught. Hadn't they been told the United States was run by greedy capitalists with no compassion? That Americans exploited workers until they collapsed? That their society was brittle and hollow, destined to crumble under pressure? But here they were being treated better than frontline soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Better than civilians in German cities. Better than they had been treated in their own homeland. Some prisoners confessed dark thoughts. That maybe they had fought for the wrong side. That maybe Hitler's assurances of German superiority were not just lies, but embarrassing delusions. They spoke quietly, careful not to offend patriotic officers who still clung to ideology like a life vest in a storm. But the storm had moved on. And nothing shattered worldviews faster than seeing your enemy throw away more food in a day than you ate in a week. The camp canteen offered chocolate bars for those who worked. Milk chocolate. Soft, sweet, melting in the mouth like a revelation. Some prisoners saved every piece, wrapping them carefully in paper to send home in Red Cross parcels. They imagined their children's astonishment upon tasting chocolate that didn't have the bitter edge of shortage and rationing. Letters home began to change. They no longer spoke only of hope for return or fear of the future. They spoke of Coca-Cola, of ice cream served with pies and hot fudge, of Thanksgiving feasts where they carved turkey and tasted cranberry sauce for the first time. They wrote of feeling human again. And they warned their families. Prepare to see a Germany rebuilt differently, because they had now seen how democracy fed its people. The war was still raging across oceans and continents. The Reich crumbled bit by bit, its soldiers falling, its cities crushed under relentless bombers. Yet here in the quiet safety of America, the war was already over for these men. And they were discovering that their defeat came with an unexpected gift: dignity. The most surprising place American hospitality appeared was at sea. On Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic, ice cream machines churned nonstop. Some prisoners, barely days out of combat, found themselves invited to try the cold dessert as waves slapped the hull. Guards leaned casually against the railings, swapping stories as though the men in front of them weren't sworn enemies. The ocean breeze carried laughter across the decks. One captured lieutenant stared at his cone in disbelief. "In Germany, only our highest generals eat this," he muttered. A guard took a playful lick off his own. "Well, here, everyone does. Everyone." The word was a revelation. Germany's hierarchy had been carved into every soldier's bones since youth. Superiority had been preached as immutable truth. Some deserved everything. Others deserved nothing. But here was a nation that fed a collapsed foe the same delights it fed its own children. When the guards laughed at simple jokes or shared cigarettes freely, it struck the POWs like a blow. These men were not the monsters propaganda had promised. They were not the weaklings they had been told to mock. They were not oppressed or miserable. They were proud, comfortable, and unbelievably well-fed. One prisoner put it best while sitting on a bench watching an impromptu baseball game. He leaned toward his comrade and whispered, "If this is what they give their enemies, imagine what they give their friends." His comrade nodded slowly, absorbing the magnitude of what he saw. It wasn't food that defeated them. It was the implications of the food. The silent message ringing from every ice cream dish and clinking Coca-Cola bottle was clear. This country is so prosperous, it can afford to treat you well. As winter approached, guards distributed coats that were warm and sturdy, better coats than the Wehrmacht ever issued. The prisoners stared at them in awe, fingers sinking into wool that felt like clouds. Some felt guilty accepting such gifts, but hunger and frost overcame pride. On holidays, the camp transformed. Christmas trees adorned the mess hall. Music played. The cooks prepared roast beef, pies, biscuits soaking in gravy. The guards wished them Merry Christmas without a trace of irony. The prisoners sang their own carols, their voices cracking as memories of home rose to the surface. Tears fell freely. This was not the war they had prepared for. This was not a world built on hatred. One night, a young guard, Private James Miller, sat at a table with several POWs, doodling on scrap paper while they discussed languages. He told them his parents came from Germany. The prisoners stared at him in disbelief. Their enemy spoke their tongue without an accent, laughed at their jokes, understood their fears. The borders of war blurred. Back in Germany, Allied leaflets rained from the sky warning that resistance was futile. But these men needed no pamphlets. They were already converted. They understood that the war they had fought for was based on lies carved into their hearts since childhood. One day, a transport truck passed by the camp delivering supplies. The side of the vehicle bore a slogan in bright lettering, "Food will win the war." The POWs chuckled quietly. Food had already won something far more valuable than a battle. It had won their minds. Every spoonful of ice cream melted not only on their tongues but into the foundations of their beliefs. Every fizzy sip of Coca-Cola tickled away a layer of indoctrination. Every wasted crust of bread chipped at the myth of German superiority. They had been taught to pity America for its decadence. Now they pitted themselves for their ignorance. At night, the sky gleamed with distant stars unobscured by smoke or searchlights. The prisoners lay awake, imagining a future where their children might taste the same sweetness they had known here. A future where life wasn't rationed. A small miracle unfolded in these camps, one silent moment at a time, a kind of victory no bomb could deliver. Inside the fence, a German soldier raised his hand, gripping a bottle of Coca-Cola. The carbonation foamed over his knuckles as he toasted the strangers who had shown him kindness. Bemused guards clinked their bottles against his. Enemies no more. The taste was crisp, like a promise. Months turned into years, and as the war finally ended, the German prisoners began their journey home. They boarded ships and trains not as hardened ideologues, but as men who had tasted a different world. Some carried chocolate bars tucked away like treasure. Others held empty Coke bottles as souvenirs, proof that a nation existed where plenty was normal and kindness was policy. They returned to cities reduced to rubble, to families who had starved while listening to promises of German greatness. And these former soldiers, once loyal to a regime built on superiority, now spoke of a land where strangers fed them ice cream and treated them with dignity. Their voices carried a quiet message that spread faster than propaganda ever could. There was indeed another way to live. A way built not on domination, but on abundance. Not fear, but opportunity. Not brutality, but humanity. In the end, America's most unexpected weapon wasn't a bomber or a battleship. It was a bottle of Coca-Cola and a scoop of ice cream, offered not to friends, but to enemies, proving that prosperity could shatter hatred more efficiently than any gun. And that small taste of freedom lingered long after the last prisoner stepped back onto German soil.